Good morning. Welcome to Washington Post Live. I'm Leigh Caldwell, an anchor here, and also co-author of the early morning newsletter, The Early 202. Today, to talk about climate, we have Senator Chris Coons, a Democrat from Delaware. Senator Coons, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Leigh. Great to be here with you.
So we're talking about climate and innovation and technology, but first, there's some news of the day I have to ask you. President Biden is meeting with 4 congressional leaders today at 3 p.m. About the debt limit. We are less than about 2 weeks away from where the X date, the debt limit, could be reached. So what do you think the chances are that the country could default?
I think we're in for a very unsettling couple of weeks. Anyone who followed closely the process by which Speaker McCarthy became Speaker McCarthy knows that he has very little running room, and his caucus includes some folks who have somewhat extreme ideas about our economy, about the debt limit. It was in no way constructive to have the former president in a recent televised town hall urging Republicans to go ahead and default. A. B. Our president has said over and over, we should not negotiate about default. I agree. We have to pay the bills that have already been accrued. It is understandable that we are also negotiating about spending, revenue, the budget, and appropriations. In fact, I'm going from here to a full appropriations committee hearing about China and the investments that Defense, State, and Commerce, those departments, are asking for to improve our competition with China. So what are the odds we're going to default? Higher than they ought to be. It would be an unforced error that would profoundly weaken us globally. If we're literally going to have all the Democrats and Republicans on the Appropriations Committee spend several hours debating about the investments we need to make in order to compete better with China, I'll make one suggestion: don't default. That's the single most important thing we could do to shore up our allies and strengthen our position at home and abroad.
Want to ask one detail about that, because part of the discussion that Republicans want to have is to roll back the Inflation Reduction Act,
right,
which is the president's big and Democrats' big accomplishment of the last Congress regarding clean energy and green energy. Is that a red line for Democrats? Is that something that they would even be willing to consider, any sort of rollback of that monumental legislation?
I don't think so. It's not just some landmark accomplishment by President Biden. It's already producing real and concrete impacts on the ground, creating more than 100,000 new clean energy jobs, attracting tens of billions of dollars of private sector investment, the majority of which, by the way, are going to red states. So we are seeing foreign auto manufacturers, foreign clean energy manufacturers bringing new plants and new projects to the United States. The intersection of the CHIPS and Science Act, the Infrastructure Bill, and the Inflation Reduction Act is driving a dramatic reshoring or onshoring of advanced manufacturing in the United States. President Biden has been president during the period of the sharpest and most rapid growth of employment in manufacturing. I'm from a state that was once a heavy industrial manufacturing state. I lived through the period where we lost our 2 auto plants, our steel mill, several of our other manufacturing plants, and the impact on the middle class in Delaware was really hard. That's part of why President Biden feels in his gut the importance of restoring manufacturing. I think he will fight very hard to resist peeling back some of these critical incentives that are reindustrializing the heartland of America.
You mentioned how some of these investments, a lot of these investments are actually in red states. Are you seeing any sort of shift in tone? Of course, you have some Republicans in the House, not all, but many, who want to repeal the IRA and the green energy investment. Are you seeing a shift in tone among your senators or even among mayors and local officials in these red states regarding green energy?
One of the things that's been striking is the number of mayors and governors and senators in red states who've come to groundbreakings, in a few cases ribbon cuttings, for projects financed through the Inflation Reduction Act. That's because good jobs are popular. And people care less about whether it's part of the green economy or the clean energy transition than they do about whether there's new good jobs available in their immediate community. I do hear from Republican Senate colleagues, friends of mine, that they're excited about the transformation in our economy, and most of them don't see this as incompatible with energy independence, with an all-of-the-above strategy. The Republican senators with whom I work closely, forgive me, are not the sorts of folks who vigorously oppose any investment whatsoever in the clean energy economy. As I think you know, Leigh, I co-founded the Climate Solutions Caucus, which has 14 members, 7 Republicans, 7 Democrats, who talk about the climate is changing, it's the result of human activity, and we have to adopt policies that will change our trajectory and produce a cleaner energy economy. So the folks I tend to talk to are ones who, while they may not have voted for the IRA, are not fundamentally opposed to it. At the farther edges of the Republican caucus, I think there are those who still insist on following the former president's insistence that this is all a Chinese hoax and there is no climate change.
So President Biden and the White House and the administration are focusing on implementation of the IRA. There's been some challenges. What do you see are the biggest challenges of making sure that this massive clean energy bill comes to fruition?
First is workforce. Something that all senators, I think, agree on, certainly talk about, is the challenges of workforce. If we're going to scale up a generational level of investment in infrastructure and advanced manufacturing and deliver the transmission grid that's needed and produce new manufacturing plants for batteries and for vehicles of all kinds, we need a workforce that is skilled and available and engaged in that sort of work. First. Second, we have permitting reform that we need to get done. We tried at the end of the last Congress. This was the piece of the Inflation Reduction Act deal between Chairman Manchin of West Virginia, the chairman of the Energy and Natural Resources Committee, and our majority leader, Senator Schumer. We put it on the floor. It did not get the votes to pass. I expect that will be coming back because we have abundant clean energy sources, offshore wind, solar and onshore wind. That is a long way from where the concentrations of population and heavy industry are in the United States. And our grid is creaky and old. You may remember an incident where a freak snowstorm in Texas just crashed their grid. Texas has its own grid. It's really not fully interconnected. If you look at the grid nationally, it does not look like a single planned unitary nationwide grid because it's not. It's been built out by a group of regional power pools. In some parts of the country, it's very strong and resilient. In other parts, it is really old. So what do we need to do to scale up the deployment of the new clean energy economy? Workforce, permitting, and actual construction. Good news, lots of great jobs. Bad news, really tough to do on a short timeline. Last piece, critical minerals. I was just at a conference in Toronto, a city which I didn't realize was really built on mining and financing mining, where we were looking at what are the critical mineral resources of North America, not just of the United States. Canada, like the United States, is blessed with abundant mineral resources. There are old mines that are now being re-examined and reconsidered because in this energy economy, some of the critical minerals co-occur with what were previously commodity minerals and metals. I've also recently been to countries like Mozambique, South Africa, Zambia, where there's huge potential for us to both develop the human potential of those nations and the mineral potential of those nations. And there's a real race on. China dominates not just the mining from other countries, but the processing of critical minerals. Right now, that's probably our single greatest challenge, is securing reliable access to the processing of critical minerals, something that needs strategic focus and investment by the United States.
I want to stick on permitting for one question because that's also a discussion that's wrapped up in these debt limit talks. So
Go figure, how timely.
Go figure, how timely. So do you think that is the best, these talks have the best chance to move permitting reform? You have Republicans who want permitting reform, but they want to expedite fossil fuel production. Right. You have some Democrats, not all, who want permitting reform. The ones who want it want to expedite the renewable projects.
Right.
What is the secret sauce to come to an agreement on something that most people in Congress think is necessary?
It's not that secret. It actually goes back to the founders. If you read Federalist Papers and some of the deliberations of the framers, it's compromise. There is a proposal, my senior senator, Tom Carper, who's the chairman of Environment and Public Works, is putting out. They're having a hearing this week. There's a proposal from Senator Manchin that's won some support, both from the administration and Senator Schumer. There's a proposal led by, I believe, Senator Capito and Senator Barrasso. I think the right result is a mix of these. We cannot gut NEPA. We cannot overturn critical environmental protections.
And NEPA is the agency that does the
It's an act.
Yeah, okay.
It's National Environmental Protection.
But it's the regulations.
It is the regulatory
hoops that
framework
you have
through
to
which
jump
permitting
through
goes.
for
Yes, it's funny. I don't off the top of my head know the name of that statute. Forgive me. NEPA review is often pilloried as taking too long and allowing too many bites at the apple. Having a single agency responsible for marshaling the review process and getting to an answer, whether positive or negative, having distinct timelines that agencies are required to follow for their review process is something I think there may be some agreement around. You're right that there is an agenda from, let's just say hypothetically, Senator Barrasso of Wyoming, to accelerate fossil fuel discovery, development, deployment. And there is an agenda by many in my caucus who want long distance transmission in order to facilitate the deployment of like wind and solar at scale, better access hydro, offshore wind. These are not irreconcilable, but it will be difficult to get to a common point that we can all agree on.
Let's talk about one bill that you have, which is a culmination of bills.
Come on.
About hydrogen, which is 4 bills.
There you go.
In one package. Can you explain what is hydrogen technology and how long is it going to take for it to be an actual legitimate source of energy?
It's a legitimate source of energy right now. Go outside, look at the sun. At scale for human use on the planet, right, sorry. The most abundant element in the universe. Hydrogen is not as energy dense as gasoline, petroleum, derivatives that have really long, the hydrocarbons that have long driven the Industrial Revolution, but which have the unfortunate side impact of pollution, air pollution of all different types, whether CO2 or methane. Hydrogen is now and has been for a long time relatively easy to produce from water. Do you remember high school chemistry? Of course you do. One of the very first experiments that you do, right? Do you remember you've got a thing of water, you've got 2 little test tubes, you take a battery, you run the charge through the water, at one end it bubbles, you gather the bubbles and it pops blue. That's hydrogen, there you go. A fuel cell and an electrolyzer either can take hydrogen and oxygen, mix them to produce water and electricity, or take electricity and split water into hydrogen and oxygen. Very coarse summary. The technology of those membranes, of the anode, and the whole process has gotten more and more efficient. There happen to be, surprise, 4 companies in Delaware who are world leaders in this specific work. Air Liquide is probably known to many in this room. It's the world leader in industrial gases, but there's other companies that are spin-offs of DuPont, like Chemours, that specialize in this. So we have to get to scale the production of hydrogen, preferably, in my view, green. It may initially be pink hydrogen from nuclear power, green hydrogen. There is a lot of debate about the different colors, about whether it should be only green or initially blue and gray and some green. There is a competition underway right now for massive investments by the federal government in a constellation of hydrogen hubs around the country. The point of that competition is to get regions to identify where can they generate hydrogen, how can they distribute it, and then who's going to use it. And the critical question, to your point about scaling, is who's going to use it. Part of the legislation that Senator Cornyn and I have been working to move forward is to accelerate the adoption of hydrogen as a fuel, for example, for long-haul trucks, for truck fleets. One of the easiest ways to use hydrogen as a fuel is if you've got heavy vehicles that begin and end the day or the week at one common fueling point. So, for example, UPS, FedEx, Amazon. These are all companies that both, because they have very large warehouses, and hydrogen's already been demonstrated to be capable of fueling, the loading material and the forklifts. And you've got truck fleets that go out and distribute and come back to one common point where they can be refueled every day. That's a likely early adopter. Buses, we already have a fuel cell powered bus that the University of Delaware has been running for, 20 years at this point. Fuel cell technology that uses hydrogen to generate power is not exotic. I think it was first patented 150 years ago. It's the membranes, the technology, and the distribution of the fuel that is. There are some promising potential opportunities in sustainable aviation fuel, in decarbonizing heavy industry. Those parts of heavy industry, like the production of steel, cement, glass, that are the hardest to decarbonize, are most likely to be decarbonized through the use of hydrogen as an advanced fuel. And back to that company I mentioned before, Air Liquide, is a world leader at figuring out how to use advanced fuels and fuel mixtures to decarbonize heavy industry. So the incentives in these bills that Senator Cornyn and I hope to move would address many of these. Ports, heavy industry, long-haul trucks.
You talked about the colors of carbon, but
Yes.
those colors also determine how much, how clean those carbons,
Correct.
that carbon or that hydrogen is. So you mentioned gray and blue, but those derive from fossil fuels.
Correct.
So what is the point of hydrogen if it is also polluting the environment? Shouldn't it all be green hydrogen?
Today, we cannot possibly run our entire economy on green hydrogen. So if the point is all of us are going to get in some vehicle of some kind and go to our homes tonight, how many of them are fuel cell cars that are running on hydrogen? Anybody? Nobody. Okay. So there is a transition that has to happen from here to there. And that's part of the whole point of the Inflation Reduction Act and of coming up with a common strategy with our core allies, which is to figure out how to decarbonize our industries and our economies on a scale and a timeline that prevents us from cooking the planet. The Inflation Reduction Act, I will remind you, which put $369 billion into a transition to a green economy, is the single biggest investment by any government in human history in the transition to a clean energy economy. But it's not going to happen overnight. The goals are, there's a 2030, 2040, 2050 key waypoints, but we have to keep moving on it. To repeal this, to turn backwards would be disastrous. So why produce any blue or gray hydrogen? Well, because we spent decades and decades building out a nationwide infrastructure. Between here and Delaware, where I happen to live, how many gas stations are there? Dozens and dozens and dozens. How many electric charging stations are there? A few dozen. You can now make it up and back, and there's electric fuel, right? You can find, right? How many hydrogen stations are there? 2. There are hydrogen fueling stations being built out, but they do not currently exist in a nationwide grid. So that's one of the things we have to do, is to begin methodically building out access to this new fuel, which is going to take investment and take time.
Why is hydrogen better than electric? Why not just, electric technology is far advanced, far more advanced than hydrogen. Why not just continue to invest there?
So I think they are in tandem. I think they smile at each other, as it were. But the scale of what we're talking about doing, let me go back to a point I made earlier. Creaky old grid that has to be sustained and in many ways rebuilt to be resilient, A. B, if you want to double the amount of electricity being generated, you got to build a lot of new generation. C, you got to transport it. D, a lot of that offtake is supposed to be going into electric vehicles. Okay. How is that electric baseload going to decarbonize the things that we still all use every day? Cement, steel, aluminum, glass. Those hard to decarbonize sectors in particular are amenable to decarbonization through hydrogen, far less amenable through electricity. It is not impossible, but very difficult. So we've got more steel in things around us than we realize. And one of the things I'm excited about working on is a carbon border adjustment mechanism that allows us to harmonize what the EU is doing on their CBAM which will soon be imposing tariffs on American exported goods if we don't work this out, and our own climate ambition. Ideally, and I've discussed this with national leaders from Canada, the UK, EU, Japan, South Korea, and Australia, ideally we would end up with a common approach to climate ambition by those economies that, like us, are committed to open societies, to free markets. And we could have a system that welcomes in products from any source, ultimately, that is manufactured in a verifiably low carbon way. But today, the carbon intensity of our steel and our aluminum and our glass is much closer to what's being manufactured in the EU than it is, speaking purely hypothetically, to things manufactured in Russia or China or India or to some extent even Mexico. So if USMCA gives us the opportunity in North America, this is NAFTA 2.0, to come up with a common carbon agenda market for our heavy industrial products, the negotiations that are already underway for a partnership around clean steel and aluminum between the US and EU may actually create the kind of market scale and market driver that then has the potential to pull the two most important at scale manufacturing players in the world, China and India. I'll leave you with this, to me, unsettling thought. Mm-hmm. China and India continue to build coal-fired power plants faster than anywhere else on Earth and will continue to do so for decades to come. Their emissions will swamp everything we do in the United States in terms of the trajectory of the climate globally if we don't find some way to incentivize a transition to a genuinely clean energy economy in those two critical countries. A market the size of the US, EU, UK, Canada, Japan, South Korea, Australia is that driver, and we can get them to change towards lower carbon production if they see this as the only way, if their products are subject to tariffs and ours are not.
Well, I was going to ask, is tariffs the answer? And
yes.
Is that, so you do have a carbon tariff plan, and what are the practicalities and realities of something like that passing through Congress?
So the good news, several Republican senators have already been speaking publicly about this. There was an important piece by Senator Kramer, Kevin Kramer, about this last year with the former National Security Advisor in Foreign Affairs, I believe. There have been both speeches, bills in drafting, and position papers by a variety of Republican senators. I'll just mention Senator Cassidy, Dr. Cassidy of Louisiana, who's been really engaged on this, is quite thoughtful, as well as Senator Kramer and Senator Graham. Is it easy to pass a carbon border adjustment mechanism? No, it's not easy. Mm-hmm. But if we were to begin the work, there is some prospect that we could harmonize with Europe. If we don't, we're going to face a challenge with Europe where their CBAM requires them to impose tariffs on our products going into the European market. I'll remind you, they were not happy with the Inflation Reduction Act. They initially were really quite alarmed, particularly French and German leaders, the relevant ministers who I met with in Europe, with Senator Manchin not long after the bill was passed and signed into law. They were irate. They were predicting the deindustrialization of Europe at their expense and our benefit. The implementation has been modified somewhat by the administration to reduce unintended harmful consequences for our allies and partners, particularly those with whom we have an FTA. But there ought to be a balance back where the Europeans are not imposing carbon-based tariffs on our market, but we're going to have to show movement in their direction if we'd like to harmonize these two common approaches towards climate ambition.
We are almost out of time, but just big picture, is there any chance that the United States can meet the climate goals of reducing carbon emissions by 50% by 2050?
Yes. Re-elect Joe Biden, President of the United States, and there is a chance that this will happen.
What if he is not reelected? What if a Republican wins?
If that Republican is the former president, I predict catastrophe, which is not too strong a word to use. We lost a critical 4 years with an administration that insisted climate change was a hoax and we should not do anything to prepare for it. That is not true of all Republicans. I don't mean to suggest that. But the President of the United States absolutely critically sets the tone for negotiations with our allies, for engagement with the world, for investment by key agencies. ARPA-E, for example, a critical part of our research and innovation capabilities, needs to be fueled and unleashed. There is a new foundation associated with the Department of Energy that I helped create that will mobilize and leverage private sector and philanthropic research. If we have a president who is leading us towards climate ambition and showing how it can actually benefit working people from all backgrounds all over our country, we can do this. We are the most innovative country on earth, and we can lead the way in these solutions.
Senator Coons, thanks so much for your conversation
Thank you.
today. And stay with us. Our program will continue in just a moment.